Hello, Eric.
Hi again, Chelsea.
How are you?
I'm good. You?
Good. Oh,
Go ahead.
I didn't want to interrupt you.
No,
but so this weekend I was watching a documentary on a breach, and it made me wonder what was the biggest breach of all time. But every list that I find online is
so
different.
you weren't trying to look and figure out what was the biggest breach ever.
Yeah.
You'll find 100 different answers.
Why?
That's, I think, part of the problem. Well, I think personally it's just hard to measure. There's no one metric to measure the size or scale of a breach. Well, even there, I just mentioned two different things: size and scale and scope. There's all these different aspects. And yet what we hear in the media is the stuff that's sensational. We'll talk about some documentaries in a little bit because I have an idea what it might have been. But there's been some media around it. There's been some fiction, some historic, based, still fictional, but there's been some nonfiction documentaries that I think are really interesting too. Mm-hmm. That talk about breaches, some of which I didn't even know had happened. And then you see this documentary, like, wow, that was amazing. That was massive. How did I not know about it?
Yeah.
Because just American media never picked up on it or didn't understand it. So they didn't know what to say about it.
Okay.
But yeah, it's an interesting question. So how do we want to phrase our question that we explore?
I don't know. I guess what
was the biggest breach ever?
That's my question. What was the biggest breach ever?
Okay, well, let's explain.
All right, let's dive in.
I think we've tasked ourselves with something that I don't expect will be possible. Maybe we prove ourselves wrong. Maybe our guest helps prove us wrong. And there is we can crown a victor as to the worst breach ever, the biggest breach ever. Even there, again, I did it. There's different ways to measure worst, biggest, most expensive.
Right.
But I think that's part of the challenge is there's so many different types of breaches that have all different impact that I think it's a difficult task to pick one.
I agree. I do know of somebody who
might be able to help.
Yeah, who probably can help us out with that.
I like to think so. And if nothing else, as usual, we'll at least explore it and hopefully all learn something along the way as we dive a little deeper in. So, we have with us our colleague, Rusty, who is known by many for his own little series he'd been doing for a while, going back a few years. I've had the joy of taking part in a couple of his episodes of Bourbon and Breaches.
Yep.
Both of which are near and dear to me. Bourbon.
You've been on a few. Yeah.
Well,
you've been on a few, Eric.
I have. I'm proud of every one of them. A little silly, and we have fun with them. But how would you describe the Bourbon and Breaches series?
I would say, it's high level. Don't go too deep, right? Talk about a breach and what might have happened as far as how it happened, what did they use to gain access, and what was the fallout or what was the data that was lost.
What's the impact?
Yeah, don't dive too deep into it, just to highlight, to kind of update people on the latest or maybe the biggest breach of the week. I did it every Friday. I have taken a little hiatus. I'm going to try and get back into it.
We've done some
after the first year and start having some more people on. But so we talked about a breach, and then of course we talked about a bourbon cocktail. So
originally, if I remember,
good with the bad.
It was just bourbons from your collection, just a bourbon itself, and then you kind of ran out of bourbon, so you had to get it into cocktails.
Well, I ran out of money. So as you can imagine, buying a new bourbon every week to review is expensive, and then you end up with like 80 bottles of bourbon at your house, which it could be a good thing, but it could also turn you into a raging alcoholic. So I started doing them with cocktails, made it a little bit better.
It was fun. We did one actually that I got to be a part of when we were in Mexico once, and there was no good bourbon, so we had to do what do we name? I think I came up with a name for that one. We had to stay alliterative,
wasn't it?
Mezcal and miskin figs.
Was that it?
It was mezcal. I think it was mezcal and miskin figs because they had no good bourbon where we were, but they had plenty of good mezcal.
Yeah,
they did have a lot of tequila and mezcal.
But the fun of it, like you said, is combining two passions of yours, one cybersecurity in general and the idea of breaches, but the other being bourbon. And we're going to focus on the former, not the latter in this case. We're fans of bourbon. But
For
That's a
later.
different. That's a whole
But
different
you heard our question,
podcast.
and we want to explore that. Can you even measure what the biggest breach ever was?
Yeah.
eh, we
Well,
can at
I
least
think
try.
it determines who you. It depends on who you ask, right? If you were part of a significant breach, that one was obviously the biggest of ever.
If your data was
If you happen
compromised, if your
if
company
you
was
happen to
affected,
be exactly if you were a
yeah.
Colonial Pipeline CISO or um, a CISO at some of these other
There,
locations.
you mentioned one, Colonial Pipeline.
Hmm.
So let's just start with one. Let's start with Colonial Pipeline. You brought it up. How would you describe the Colonial Pipeline incident? I won't even call it a breach until you describe it. But just at a high level, again, what was the impact? What was the concept? And
Well, from reading about it, and it it's they say that it happened because of one user password that was compromised, and that they were able to infiltrate the network, which brought a lot of systems down. And me personally, I'm on the East Coast, you're on the East Coast. It affected the ability to send gas. Of course, it's over exaggerated because people hear it on the news and they run to the gas station and fill up cans and everything. So, I mean, gas stations were out of gas. The the funny thing is where I live in Florida, we're not even supplied by the pipeline. They actually truck the gas over here, and we still ran out. But it was it was a very, from a impact standpoint on a lot of people in the mid Atlantic Southeast United States, it was a huge impact. Um, Trying to
Was
get
it an
gas and
employee's password or
what was
like was
that?
was it an
Yeah, it
employee's
was
password?
from what I've read, it was a compromised password. Someone got off of the web, and then they were able to. I don't know if they used VPN or some sort to get in. I mean, typically that'd be an easy way to do it. You get a hold of someone's Active Directory credentials. Um, you find out what their VPN address is, and you're in. And depending on
you just
customers,
log into the system
Eric,
remotely.
yeah, and I mean, now some people lock that down, right? You can only access certain things, but there are customers, or not customers, but there are companies out there that once you're in,
Hmm.
and and
Especially back then.
they can go around, right? So, there's a big fallout from it. I think Colonial paid $4.4 million in Bitcoin to get their data unransomed. Now, if I'm remembering correctly, I didn't look it up today, but I think the FBI was able to get a good portion of that money back and give it back to Colonial Pipeline. Which, if that's the case, they probably made money if they left it in Bitcoin because it's went from whatever it was 40,000 to 90,000.
I only
So
got half my
they may
Bitcoin
have
back. It's more now
they
than
may
it
be
was.
the only company that ever made money because of ransomware. I don't know.
Interesting.
Do you have to pay in like
Well,
Bitcoin or
usually they
something? I
want
feel like that's what I
an
hear more.
untraceable cryptocurrency, and that's
Okay.
why if you pay them
Yeah.
in I'd say maybe crypto is the modern day equivalent of unmarked bills.
Okay.
Back when it was paper, it had to be
Yeah.
unmarked, like non-sequential
So
serial numbers in the $100 bills, so you can't
it's a
trace it.
lot. Yeah, it's a lot harder to trace it. Obviously, in this instance, I think they were able to. I don't know how, but it's definitely a lot harder.
And that's a whole different discussion for another day. Someday we'll explore the crypto world and the blockchain. It's
Blockchain.
intriguing and
Yeah.
amazing that there are ways still to trace it to some
Hmm.
degree sometimes. But that description brought up a couple different aspects of where it was big. It was big because if the panic it created,
Hmm.
you hear about this thing on the news. Oh, you can't get gas, so people run out to get gas, and
I was gonna
that
say the
creates
impact.
pricing issues and access issues and safety issues. It was big because it did actually stop or slow or impact the flow of gas in certain places, but also
Hmm.
because of the finance. What was the impact of the actual cost? The company had to shell out money. But there's that other one we didn't talk about yet is the reputational impact now. Where as an
Hmm.
organization, do you trust them doing business with them? I mean, as a customer with this example, that choose to get
Yeah.
your gas from some other pipeline. That's not
Yeah.
something the consumer can say. Oh, I don't trust
No.
them anymore.
No.
But there's
Well,
still a reputational impact.
of course, this blended the lines too between government entity and private sector, right? Because
Regulated critical
Colonial
infrastructure.
Pipeline's critical infrastructure, and right after this and some high-profile attacks in Florida that we can talk about some of those in a bit. But like the governor here in Florida is any state local entity is by law not allowed to pay a ransomware. So if they get ransomed, they're not allowed to pay it. So it has some.
Go ahead.
I was going to say it has some implications, that stem just from not just Colonial Pipeline, but from a number of incidents here locally too.
That speaking about that idea of how you deal with impact, we've had another episode we talk about essentially the shit hits the fan episode. What do you do when something goes wrong? Incident response. And one of my favorite examples with that was the casino breaches, where MGM and Caesars were both ransomed.
Mm-hmm.
And what was great about that example is they both responded in very different ways. One pays the ransom, one doesn't. And then that plays out very differently for them. Where I like that, if a government says you're not allowed to, it's illegal to pay the ransom, that makes you think a little bit more about it. And the idea of not paying ransoms is to disincentivize ransomware. If you can't pay the ransom, you can never capitalize on it. You stop trying to ransom entities.
Yeah, I think that's right. That's the hope, right? To lessen the
long-term view,
lessen the target of entities in Florida for the bad guys if they know they're not going to get paid. I don't know how.
Don't ransom a company in Florida.
Who knows if
you can't capitalize.
Yeah. Okay, that makes sense. Because I was gonna say, so are you just?
Well, there's a lot of targets, right? Hackers usually, unless it's there are directed attacks against entities that someone just wants to get into, right? But a lot of attackers who are just looking to ransomware things for monetary reasons, they don't have a vendetta against anyone. They're just trying to hit low-hanging fruit. So if they're going for anywhere in the United States or in the world, and they know, look, if I hit these companies in Georgia or these cities, local entities, and they're willing to pay, but I hit them in Florida and they won't pay, I'm going to hit the ones in Georgia. I mean,
well, it's like survival in the jungle. You don't have to be the fastest. You just have to be faster than the slowest to not get eaten by the lion.
So, so
somebody else.
I think that was the incentive. Exactly.
Well,
you don't have to be. You don't have to be. Yeah. You just can't be as slow as the slowest person.
You. I just have to be more secure than you.
Exactly.
It is somewhat true, and yet by bragging about it, you paint a bigger target on yourself too, which is you have to be careful. But
so, statistically, then is Florida like a much lower? Do they have? Question. You know what I mean?
Do you know if is there a measurable impact, or has there been so far?
Yeah. Well, I haven't seen since the law was enacted. I haven't seen a ton of breaches in the news in Florida. I know there has been a couple down in Broward County. Their schools got hit, but I don't know if that was before or after the ransomware. I'm sure. I'm sure people are still going to try to hit it.
But also ransomware is not the only way to financially capitalize on a breach. Sometimes it's the simplest one for people to connect that don't understand is if they break into a bank and steal the bank's money directly. That's just incredibly difficult. That's not a low-hanging fruit. That's a very difficult way to do it. What they found is the ransomware is a way that they don't have to deal with the bank. They just capture anybody's data and then say, hey, give me money to get your data back.
Yeah.
Or to not expose your data. Ransomware probably is always profit-driven.
Okay.
I would say typically. Yeah. Because the whole, it's called ransomware. So, now you could just be mad. You could just be mad at someone and say, I'm just going to mess with them. But
I'm just going to encrypt your data. But
we have had
ransomware is going to destroy it. You're going to inconvenience somebody by
it's a different kind of breach.
taking access away.
Now, what I don't know, and I didn't look into the law, was if you could hold people's data hostage for payment. You know what I mean? You're not ransomware in it. You're going to leak it if you don't. Because a lot of times these ransomwares turn into twofold now, right? So they don't just have you on right.
It's already illegal,
right?
Isn't that kind of what the Ashley Madison?
Oh, Ashley Madison was I remember when I first heard them on the radio like 15 years ago. Basically, they're advertising have an affair safely through us.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
Okay. And I thought, honestly, I thought, wow, what a great scam that would be. to have everybody volunteer their information to you,
Yeah.
collect all this information, all these people that had affairs, and then blackmail them to not sell their data. And I still, to this day, I there's a little piece of me, I'm not a conspiracy theorist, but there's a piece of me that wonders if their breach wasn't an internal breach, that they're just finding a new way to capitalize on their data.
Well, I mean, wasn't it that literally I
Maybe.
think that the person said, like, shut down your site or I'm leaking
Somebody who was
everybody's
offended
names.
by it.
Yeah.
It's I'm not going to argue the ethics of the
A
whole
scorned
thing.
lover.
I'm
A scorned.
it's an angry
It
wife.
was.
They're
It was
not going
probably
to
a.
sponsor us anyway,
It
so we
was.
can offend them.
But that's
It was
what I mean.
Yeah.
And I
It
don't
could have
think
been.
for money, right? They were
There's
just
been an angry, scorned.
yeah.
But even then, that could still be just the excuse that it was somebody inside that
Yeah.
owned the data. They'd sold whatever the membership fees. I don't even know how they monetized it, but isn't it almost worth
Well, I
more
don't know.
and then keep your data private after we have it?
Do you remember the list that they posted? I don't know if it was on. It was on one of the. It wasn't GitHub, but it was some. They posted the list of everyone's email.
Yep.
So I mean, we're at work. Obviously, I worked for a local government at that time in North Carolina, and we're pulling down the list to see who's used
Who
their
was on it?
Active Directory email for it. But it was a big scandal at like Wells Fargo and Bank of America because people actually logged into the sites with their stupid Active
Log
Directory
in with their corporate email.
email.
Don't know your
I'm like,
private email
why would
address.
you do this? But I guess their spouse didn't have access to their corporate email. But
Yeah, interesting.
yeah, that's a lot of people.
Well, that was an interesting breach. I'm glad you brought that one up too. I hadn't even thought of it, but that's a whole different impact. That causes harm in a totally different way, whether it's directly financial or just reputational or being a nuisance or revenge really against the site. If that was why it was motivated, was to,
Well, and we just talked about it, is ransomware always about money usually, but attacks certainly aren't always about money. This clearly was
yeah. But
revenge or motivate or activism.
Another one popped into mind from maybe like 10 years ago, which was Sony. Remember when Sony was compromised?
Yeah.
And that was
the movie.
Politically motivated because a movie was coming out that I won't mention who was not happy about. Didn't want that movie to come out, said no. And okay, nation state attack Sony, breach them, leak all their movies, and basically say, no, you can't put that movie in theaters. And it did affect the release of the movie. So there was financial impact, political impact, and really disruptive in a very specific, very targeted way.
Now I'm very curious about.
We can get it. Do you remember the details on that? And that's something we can talk about offline too.
The Sony, it wasn't it.
It was North Korea, basically.
It was North Korea, but it had
with.
Oh,
what's his name?
One with
He was fat, nice, skinny. He's fat.
Seth Rogen.
What's it? James Franco, right?
Seth Rogen. And
maybe James.
Yeah,
I don't
Seth
remember.
Rogen.
I never saw it. I wanted.
I never watched it.
I wanted to see it more when I heard that news break. Then I got more interested in the movie. Like, oh, I can't see it now. I want to.
But, I never watched it. I never saw it.
Which also then again that tiny piece of me that isn't a conspiracy theorist, but I get them and I think they're intriguing. Was maybe that was all a ploy to build up publicity for the movie.
Yeah,
I mean, maybe. Well, it's interesting that you brought up that particular one because we talked about monetary motivation to do a hack, right? Ransomware, get paid $4.4 million, or this one was state sanctioned, right? So I want to talk about this one because this was a huge breach that a lot of people. I mean, everybody's heard of it mostly, but they don't understand it if they didn't, or what the details were. But Stuxnet.
You know where I think you are. It's the one that in our industry people have heard about it.
Yeah, Stuxnet, right? It basically reduced Iran's nuclear program or delayed it by years.
Uranium enrichment plant, right?
Yeah,
it was a uranium enrichment plant to create fuel for nuclear weapons potentially, or other
nuclear
power or other uses.
They managed to, I think, and you could correct me if I'm wrong, but it seems I remember they had an insider with a USB drive that was able to put it in a computer to deploy it. But maybe
That sounds right. This might have been
That's
the
not right.
documentary you were watching. Was it called 0 Days?
Yeah.
I think that's the
I
one. It's
think
a
so.
documentary was done a few years ago, maybe 5, 6 years ago, about
Yeah.
Stuxnet, which was, and this is not a recent thing. This was 15 plus years ago.
2010. Yeah.
Okay, so yeah, it's almost 15 years ago. And it's still very debated and sort of hush hush in a lot of ways because nobody wants to necessarily claim ownership and admit to being behind it.
Even in the beginning of the documentary, it was nobody wanted to like talk about it. Like they were
Yeah.
like, I'm not
It's
saying anything. Like,
it's definitely like people are pretty sure it was the U.S. and Israel, right?
Well,
Um,
between Israel and Mossad and the U.S. and who had the ability and the motive, and that's what crimes come down to, access,
yeah.
motive,
They overspun Chelsea. I don't know if you watched it. They overspun the centrifugals. Centrifugals, am I pronouncing that right?
centrifuge.
The centrifuges, so that they went beyond their capability and exploded, came apart,
okay.
basically.
But it was a data breach. It was a digital
Mhm.
breach. Again, through a little insider. There was another one that I always thought of in a similar capacity. It was I think a steel plant in Germany, maybe even before that, maybe 20 years ago. That what's interesting to me is it relates to a physical problem that could actually physically harm humans through something somebody typed. And it was a similar aspect where it was a steel plant that has controls and limits on their controls with temperature sensors that if something gets too hot, it shuts down. And the attack recalibrated the sensors so that it could be really, really hot, but they didn't think it was. So they keep ratcheting up the heat until the point that it causes fires and things combust. And that's essentially what Stuxnet did with the centrifuges, is it didn't limit the speed the way it was supposed to. So things spun out of control and physically explode.
Yeah.
And cause problems. And in theory, you could, blow up a nuclear power plant using the same kind of things if those controls were physically connected or accessible by someone trying to do bad things or which that's going to get us off topic quickly, and we can talk about other things. We actually have another episode planned talking about OT and IoT and separation of physical stuff and especially public networks and the internet. But it's a different type of breach that has physical impact that's hard to measure. I mean, if they had exploded and blown up a town, that's how do you measure that financially or against financially?
Well, I mean, listen, I think we're missing the biggest breach of all is when we almost had global thermonuclear war from the movie WarGames.
You're talking about my favorite movie, which we've talked about in
with
other episodes.
With a modem and a telephone.
With an acoustic coupled modem.
He almost caused global nuclear war.
Well, and I referenced that Daniel, Matthew Broderick's character in that movie was from that was 1983, I do believe. So I was still little, but it was my first exposure to the concept of hacking and breaching. But I verified recently, nowhere in that entire movie, and I did this for the digital copy of the script or the subtitles I found, nowhere is the word hack or hacker used in that entire movie.
But what happened?
Really?
So bring me up to speed on it fully.
Well, he's another one that the character in that movie started a process on a computer that the government had enlisted to run simulations on how to win a nuclear war, and kind of started down this process of simulating, but then it wasn't simulating. And that same computer also, and it was actually an AI, arguably it was an early form of an AI before we had the term AI, because it would run games against itself to try and figure out which strategy was the best or would be successful. But it also happened to have control over the nuclear launch codes. So it could actually launch the weapons. So the fear was.
Well, and it was all, so it was, and it was just playing a game, but the people at NORAD thought it was real, so they didn't know if they were going to get hit or if we were launching.
The Russians, and this is, of course, in the height of the Cold War. This was when nuclear war was a really very real threat in everybody's day-to-day lives in the U.S. and Russia, especially in the Soviet Union, excuse me. And their alarms go off that Russia just launched, but it was actually the game simulating it and playing it. They didn't know the difference. But then the same kid, high school kid, who unknowingly thought he was playing games, started this whole thing. He ends up, of course, having to be the one who stops it.
Okay.
I don't want to spoil it for anyone. If you haven't seen the movie, WarGames.
It's classic.
The 1983 one, not the remake from many, many years later. But the original WarGames movie, outstanding. I use it as examples of good and bad cybersecurity in many different ways. There were some good, poignant examples, but some also very
classic. I didn't mean to
mistakes.
take
Like
us
the fact
off.
that this computer had a modem plugged into a public phone line is I think, the simplest.
Yeah.
Really idea.
So wait, this is fiction?
This was a movie. This was Hollywood.
Okay.
Yeah. It didn't. That's why Rusty's not saying this was the biggest ever, but it was one of those that.
I was, no, I was joking. I forgot how young you were, Chelsea. I didn't realize War Games was a foreign concept to you. I'm sorry.
Well, you brought it up more than
I brought it up other times, so we'll talk about Hollywood in a different episode and the fun we have with Hollywood. But I found that movie, especially for its day, was very poignant and had some great examples.
yeah.
I'm glad you mentioned it completely unsolicited by me this time.
But I think it was real, though.
I will say,
I have to watch it one of these days.
Yes.
Yeah.
I'll watch it after.
I will say some of the bigger impacted hacks I've seen. I mean, there's many examples of hospitals getting impacted and treatments degraded. But then I think the two biggest ones come to my mind: supply chain attack, SolarWinds, that impacted many government organizations, and it was undetected for 14 months. I don't think we still know the impact of what all they got.
Well, that's a really good point, because you still find new. They keep uncovering newly affected organizations that didn't know.
Yeah.
I think I know.
And that was and supposedly that was a Russian state sanctioned attack as well.
That group to just infiltrate the supply chain, get their malware into distributed software that everyone is by choice installing and not knowing that there's another aspect to that software now that they basically invited into their environment by trusting the supply chain.
Well, yeah, and what the bad part about that is Chelsea, SolarWinds is a product that companies buy to monitor their networks and monitor servers and stuff like that, among other things. But these guys were able to get into SolarWinds, put malware in the update that SolarWinds created. So when customers went to SolarWinds website, went to upgrade their software to the next version, they were infected.
Unknowingly.
Yeah.
Unknowingly affected for about 14 months. So Department of Defense, I think, I can't remember all the federal agencies that were impacted, but along with many other customers.
Was the second one you're going to go at Log4j?
Yeah.
You mentioned, because it's a similar idea that software that's leveraged by other software.
Okay, yep.
So it's widely distributed.
By almost every software.
Everything running on Linux.
Everything,
basically had this library in it that was corrupted. And if I remember, because I looked into that one a little bit too, and that was not a short term, somebody gets angry and does something. That was a long term, a long con, we could say, where there were seeds planted years before for the individual or individuals who implemented this to gain access and trust to be able to inject what they injected into.
And I think Log4j was a vulnerability that was. I think when I was reading it, like it had been around since 2013 or something like that. No one had found it, right? And then someone found it, of course, and then it got leaked out. But
that's an important point too, is that a lot of these things we don't know about them until we know about them.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, and if it's a good
how long were they around? If there's good and bad, but if it's a successful malware, doesn't show itself.
Yeah.
If we go back to viruses, back when that was what we called malware, because that's all we had, a successful virus had to spread itself, and this is where the term, I love the analogy of a physical biological virus. It was the same idea. It has to spread quickly enough that it's not detected. So you transmit it while you're contagious, and then it keeps spreading before somebody knows they had it and says, "Oh, by the way, I'm going to stay inside and not spread my germs." Not to be too timely, but we had that recently with the pandemic, that the bug was able to spread very, very quickly, but not. I'll make a comparison to Ebola. It was so fatal so quickly that it didn't spread. Like everyone would die from it, and we had Ebola Zaire and other massively deadly diseases. They're too effective at delivering their payload before they spread, whereas a good virus, a successful virus, spreads very widely before it delivers its payload
And like
and wreaks
rapidly.
havoc.
Yeah,
And you see
before it
that
can
with
get
malware.
isolated, right?
Yeah, before
It
you can
has
even
a
identify it
yeah.
and even know it's there.
Yeah.
It just spreads everywhere.
Survival. Yeah, survival and propagation is its goal.
Well, I remember I'll go way back to viruses. I'll go back to the Michelangelo virus. Remember that? This was back 90s.
Yeah.
There was a virus that had transmitted via floppy disks and whatever, and it spread everywhere. And the whole idea was that it would eventually trigger on Michelangelo's birthday on some year, whatever year it was. But it didn't do anything until the clocks and the calendars hit that date. I don't remember the motivations. I
just
didn't
sat
care enough
sat
about it.
there.
I just remember, but the whole idea was it sat dormant until a particular day and then would go active. So even if you'd had it for 3 years, you wouldn't know and you just keep spreading it.
Is that kind of like, remember like Y2K or whatever? When
That
it was
was a
like
real thing.
Wait, but I thought that everyone thought
Well, there were questions about what the impact would be when your two-digit year field said 00 instead of 99.
So,
And what do you think it was, 1900 or 2000? And
yeah,
would someone who was born in 1980 be 20 years old or be negative 80 years old?
they were worried about systems. So this may or may not be true too, but I mean, if you ever see an old computer system at IBM Chelsea from long ago, they take up a whole room, right? And whenever they were initially coming out, even my PC Junior had like I can't even remember, 512K of memory. So in order to save space, they used 2 digits instead of 4. And this could be totally bogus, but this is what I read somewhere.
Well, when you type
It's been
the
a
date,
long time.
when you write out the date, do you write 2024? Do you just write 24?
I write 2024.
Okay.
Well, now you do.
Yeah, different generation.
Yeah, you didn't back in the day. We also didn't have to use area codes every time we called somebody, but
Well, that's a whole different analog problem.
But anyway, Y2K was like everyone was trying to update all their software.
Okay, so it wasn't like the same thing that you were just discussing.
It was just a lack of foresight in digital systems that would only store 2 digits for the year.
Okay.
Which is fine up until, when the technology was developed, it was 19 something. It was the 20th century. So everything was 19 something.
Okay.
Mm-hmm.
But then when you're approaching 2000, well, now how are you going to differentiate between 2001 and 1901 if all you have is the last 2 digits?
Well, it's like
there was speculation planes are going to fall from the sky.
Yeah, there really was.
It's like flames, and a lot of that was silly and frivolous. But
it's like if your speedometer in your car only goes up to 100,000 miles and you go to 101, it goes back to 0, right? They didn't know what was going on.
You said speedometer.
Odometer. Sorry, odometer.
100,000, that's impressive, but
odometer. Odometer.
No, but it's very true. And now odometers in a lot of cars, they will add another digit just to imply that you can have this car for 1 million miles and it'll be okay. You can usually tell when a car's over 100,000 miles, though. The odometer's saying 5,000 on that 25-year-old car.
I was going to say because people like rolling back, right?
But we're getting way off topic, which we
way off
do.
topic. Way off topic.
But so we've already talked about a bunch of different types of impact that a breach or a malware or an attacker can lead to, whether it was deliberate, whether it was physical impact, whether it was just financial, reputational, just annoyance. So is it even possible to crown a victor in the biggest breach ever? Or
it sounds like you
I don't know that we can. We can keep talking about it forever.
I mean, they each have impacts that are different, right? Whether it's loss of data or
well, that's another way.
Monetary.
To realize to get paid, I could actually just steal data that I can then broker and sell.
Mm-hmm.
The data itself can be monetized without ransomware, without espionage, without blackmail.
Yeah,
and that's happened quite a bit. Is just theft of data. And these are some of the bigger in, I guess, scope of the number of individuals impacted are some of these massive data breaches where they've stolen databases of millions or hundreds of millions of people's personal identifiable information that they can then sell directly.
Yeah, they sell it. Well, and a lot of the latest ransomware attacks that I talked about on Bourbon and Breaches were twofold. They were ransomware and they were the hostages. They're like, hey, you can pay us to get your data back, but you're also going to pay us not to let someone else have your data.
Every
and then
week we're going to release a
and
million
they
more
and they
records.
race a little more, a little more, a little more,
Yeah.
and then it becomes a liability issue with the company that had the leak. So they have to take that into consideration. I mean, they've already been damaged reputationally. But how much money are they going to outlay? What is it going to be cheaper to pay the ransom or pay the
Yeah.
um, the
There was
to prevent them from leaking data? It's those are questions that I don't want to have to I'll never have to worry about, but because I'm not running a company, I'm not a CISO, so thank God.
Yeah. Well, there's again, just talking about this. I keep remembering so many different little things over the years. Even before we were talking a lot about this, different breaches of different companies. And I don't want to name all the companies. Almost every big company has had something happen.
Right.
I think the less lucky of them have done it in a public way or
Mhm.
had it be exposed and be made public. I would speculate that a lot of them we don't even know about because they haven't had to disclose. You were seeing more regulation, especially publicly traded companies or public entities where they now have to disclose. And there have been some recent issues where they didn't disclose quickly enough because they hoped they could sweep it under the rug and not
That's what
damage their reputation.
I was going to ask, like, is there a law that says like you have to?
If I'm not mistaken, they're currently evolving laws,
Okay.
and there's bills that are being reviewed, and they're trying to make it so that. Go ahead.
I'm sorry. I don't know about a law, but there is a SEC. Like if you're a publicly traded company, the SEC has rules in place that you are to disclose. Because what was it, the Uber
Yeah, you can't have a
breach?
CEO dumping all of his shares before everybody else knows they were breached.
He's
That's
on
out of
he's on trial. So
yeah.
um, but the SEC definitely has guidelines or rules that that will you have to disclose in a certain amount of time.
Yeah. And yet it's not immediate. It's not like the second because there's a certain reasonable amount of time to figure out just what's going on, because sometimes it could be a false flag. It could be something that's misunderstood, and you need to try and get the scope. But you can't just say, oh, well, we're still investigating for 6 months. Well, you don't tell anybody.
Yeah.
It's and government entities have to get involved. Again, public is different than private. Government is different than public. It's still public, but there are different evolving regulations, and I know that's an ongoing thing. We could check back in a year and have different answers, but disclosure is a big deal.
But it does sound like there's too much complexity to measuring the impact of a breach to have one that's the most.
If we were going to try and give awards, which I don't want to award breaches, I mean, that's kind of the opposite of what we're trying to do. We're trying to stop them. But if we wanted to kind of recognize the biggest, we'd probably have to do like most award shows do and have categories.
What would you say the most notorious, like the most well-known one is, though?
Well, I think that also would depend on who you are. Like to people in the cybersecurity industry, Stuxnet, I think when I have conversations with colleagues and coworkers and people in this industry, that still holds out there as, wow, that was impactful, it was major, but the average consumer probably doesn't know much about it, or if they've ever even heard of it.
Yeah, that was the one that came up because I was Googling it, but that was the one that came up the most as like.
But I'd argue it's probably the most recent, whatever was recent.
Mm-hmm,
the casinos back at the end of 2023.
The
T-Mobile,
pipeline.
when that happened, remember when T-Mobile was breached?
I mean,
people stole photos, like private photos of celebrities right off of T-Mobile. That was big news when that happened.
Yeah.
Which time?
I believe it was a T-Mobile. This was probably 10, 15 years ago, but T-Mobile's
I think
network,
T-Mobile, they have incident response lawyers on speed dial because they've been hacked like 3 times, 3 or 4 times in the last 5 years.
I think they were like, everybody in Hollywood was using. They had a lot of towers in Hollywood, so all these celebrities had their, and it was before even referring to the cloud. Their photos were synchronized to T-Mobile's cloud, and somebody breached it and was leaking illicit photos of celebrities.
Very personal photos.
Yeah, I recall that.
But when it's happening, that's when it's big, and then they all kind of fade away, and we stop thinking about them. But the average consumer, the average person stops thinking about them. But I think they're all poignant in their own way.
I don't
whichever
think
one affects you. I think you mentioned earlier, Rusty. Whichever one affects you is the biggest.
Yeah, whichever one affects you the most, right? So the pipeline affected a lot of people. They couldn't get gas. I was reading today and looking for discussion topics on the show for the show today. There's a uh, hospital in Mobile, Alabama that was attacked. Didn't inform a woman who was coming in for to give birth, basically. Couldn't use a lot of the equipment. They were using paper to write down manual, monitoring and stuff. Unfortunately, the baby passed away. She's suing the hospital because they didn't disclose they were having a cyber attack. So, I mean, these are real
I know healthcare has been
world
very
impacts.
targeted
So,
the last few
so
years.
certainly the biggest, the biggest cyber attack in her mind would be that one, obviously.
Yeah.
So
Yeah.
it's very hard to quantify what is the biggest, or you like Eric said, you'd have to have categories. What was the most money? What was the most
Yeah.
harmful to people?
Biggest, biggest
What was the
cyber
most
attack in a
helpful?
comedy, in a drama.
I was
in
gonna
a-
say, so we'll do an
a
awards show
musical.
later.
Yeah, my fear is that the biggest one, the most impactful and most significant, is one we don't know about yet.
Yeah.
Because we only know about the ones we know about. That there's the fear that there's actually the knowledge that there's a lot of stuff going on that nobody's aware of yet, or some people are aware of. They're trying to deal with it and mitigate it before it becomes known. And especially when you get to the nation state stuff, where you get to politically motivated, really warfare motivated in cyber warfare. There's a lot of stuff that seeds have been planted by all civilized nations against each other to kind of be prepared. And that stuff, is scary and very impactful, but we have no proof or details on any of it yet. And those are the ones that I think are potentially scary, but we can't give them awards yet because we don't know about them.
Stay tuned. I'm just kidding.
I think that I think the state-backed ones are the most concerning to me, just because the number of resources that a country like China or Russia has that's trying to get in. I mean, like the SolarWinds, right? They're not just going in for they're certainly not going in for monetary reasons. They're going into the Department of Defense, other agencies that have highly sensitive data and retrieving it. And in a case of like a China who's known to copycat technology, their fighter planes, their ships, and everything else. I mean, if they get the blueprint to the stealth bomber, they're going to have a stealth bomber over there in 5 years. I don't know.
You mentioned China. I'll bring up a very controversial statement that I know some people, including some listening to this right now while we record, producer Eva, that maybe we're being infiltrated in ways we don't even think are infiltration by things like TikTok that could eventually be weaponized. And that's part of the fear. And I know this is in debate and politically controversial right now for obvious reasons, but some of these things that we depend on, it becomes a way of life, becomes natural. You accept it. You give that app permissions on your phone without thinking twice about it.
Yeah.
We're enabling the potential for even bigger breaches down the road. The more we become dependent on technology, the more we trust technology, whether we should or not.
Yeah.
I think that's part of the problem, is we're just becoming so accepting of day-to-day conveniences and things we like and enjoy and are entertained by.
It's kind of like boiled frog. Like, we'll not really think about, it's like, well, if they want permissions to everything on my phone, so I can watch this cooking video.
Yeah. What do I care? I don't have any data on my phone but you use it for work. What is your bank account on your phone? You have a banking app. There are things you need to think about. And I think the consumer world has done a good job of just accepting technology by now, but also trusting it maybe a little too much.
Well, I
Just
mean,
accept.
Yeah,
and move on.
I feel like I don't know. I feel like a lot of us feel like all of our our info's been sold somewhere already.
Yeah.
Oh yeah, we all have credit monitoring for life.
I was going to say, if you don't have free credit monitoring, you're entitled to it. I can almost guarantee.
Yeah,
you can turn it on. Call any of your credit card companies and say, I want it because you owe it to me, and they probably do. Yeah, that is scary, but that a lot of people don't know is going on. They don't know their information's out there. So I guess maybe if I try to answer the question, the biggest breach, the most significant breach, is probably one we either don't know about yet, or it's actually happening now and we don't know about it. And we eventually someday will, and then there'll always be a bigger one and a bigger one, and until we reach the next
There's like a
dark
till
ages or something that technology.
Yeah, they'll always. Someone's
Until the
always.
zombie apocalypse when
Yeah, when the no more
walkers.
computers.
final breach.
I'm ready for that one. Um,
Ready for
yeah,
that?
yeah. I think technology advances. There's to Eric's point, our entire life is digital. So out there, and I think there'll be more and more attacks, obviously, and the people who defend it get smarter as well. There's a disconnect there between the people who are trying to hack you and the people trying to defend you. That mushy middle ground that is the consumer has to take it serious and
Mhm.
has to do their part. When a patch comes out, you patch your systems. Notifications come out that you have to, if this certain vulnerability, it's got to be addressed. But will it be?
Well,
Who knows?
that kind of gets to part of why we're doing what we're doing is to get information out there, converse, discuss it, learn from different perspectives, share education and knowledge, because that's ultimately the best thing to do is get everybody a little bit more defensive minded. And I think that's been part of our problem is people trusting that somebody else has their back. Oh, my government will protect me. Oh, my company will protect me. I
Yeah.
can
I
do
don't
this
need to do
silly
anything
thing
for it.
because
Yeah.
security is somebody else's responsibility.
Yeah.
I think that's the mindset that's gotten us into a lot of trouble.
Mhm.
And if we had a mindset where everyone was at least a little bit more diligent, I think that would be only good. For
Oh
everybody.
yeah.
But I don't know how to
Yeah.
do it.
Well, I
Maybe we
think
should have
there's a disconnect between like our generation, the people who are like my parents are not savvy. I mean, they can use the internet, but they're not savvy in ways of, there may or may not have been an instance back in the day. Remember when you'd get an infection and then all it would do is pop up a screen saying you're infected, buy this antivirus software to get rid of it.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Um, you know,
Great
those type
marketing.
of things. Those are good for I would say the unknowing computer users from previous. But I mean, as kids now today, and I mean, I've got my grandson here here at the house with me this week. He's 4.5 years old, and he's like pulls his iPad out, brings up Peppa Pig and watches it, or goes to YouTube and watches Bluey cartoons. Like, technology is ingrained in these kids
Yeah.
Mhm.
now. So hopefully they'll be a little more serious about being responsible or
Yeah.
knowing
Is it
when
even
something's not
possible
right.
to be a functional member of society and not be connected? You say you want to get rid of
Yeah.
your digital footprint. How do you pay your bills?
Right. Yeah.
How do you?
Yeah.
It's become very difficult to survive without this. So we've become so
A
dependent
check,
on it.
Eric. A check.
Well, that's what makes a lot of fiction interesting when they talk about, the internet going away. Or there was another TV show. I don't think it lasted long. I think it was called Revolution, which was the premise. It was around the early Walking Dead days. Well, you get this
Yeah.
post-apocalyptic world, but their premise was there's no more electricity,
Uh,
and they had a
Chelsea.
reason they eventually explained. But if there was just no more electricity, what would that do to the world?
Oh,
And
it
that
would
was
go.
just the concept of it.
Well, isn't that like
You
a
know.
fear that people have right now?
y-
A grid
Well, I was
shutting
going to
down.
say.
You still have batteries, you still have solar, there's still, but there was just electricity just didn't function anymore worldwide was the premise. So
uh, a
communication, like
nuclear EM,
We all
EMT,
die.
EMP. I was going to ask Chelsea, have you ever written a check?
I have. I have. Yes.
how many?
Well, I used to have to a place I worked,
Okay.
so I was
Okay.
signed. But my mom loved checks. She probably still is writing.
Another decade they'll be saying, why do we call them checking accounts? Because we have to check our balance every now and then. Yeah.
I
yeah.
actually
Sorry.
I
I,
used to be like the only
yeah.
person I knew who went into the bank too. Like I liked going into the bank. Like I wouldn't.
Well, I
Well,
got a CD for Christmas music from the VFW, and I'm like, what am I going to play that on? I don't
Yeah,
have. I don't even have
yeah,
a CD player anymore.
yeah.
because
Well,
my
Uh,
boyfriend still has like a VCR, and I'm like, why would you? Why?
I know. Well, as we tend to, we're getting way off topic again. We've already gone long.
Yeah.
I want to be respectful of your time, Rusty, as well. Um, this was great, though. I appreciate it. We'll talk again soon, I'm sure. But
yeah.
so I
Look forward
think
to it.
from my perspective, the only way to answer our question of what was the biggest breach ever, since I can't answer it, since I don't think we can, of all the breaches we've talked about and some that we haven't, I don't think we can pick one that globally is bigger than all the rest. So I'll just say if I'm forced to answer, I'll say it's probably one we don't know about yet.
Okay.
Is probably the biggest, because there's got to be one to rule them all eventually some days.
Or
as
it's just
awful as
open
that
to
sounds.
interpretation.
Or yes, it's everyone gets their own answer. Does either of you want to answer differently? Have your own? What you think is the biggest?
Probably the one that if you're in IT, the biggest is, like I said, the one that they called you back into work on Saturday night to patch all your systems for 48 hours.
One that affected your company.
That would be the biggest.
Yeah, it's your perspective. Chelsea,
Or, it wasn't a hack, but when CrowdStrike had their little issue earlier, I got stuck in New York City.
Yeah.
Got stuck in New York City and Charlotte for several hours.
Well, it's a great example, and we're over for time, but that wasn't a breach. That wasn't a deliberate hack compromise. That was a susceptibility that
was a
had it
oopsie.
been caused by a breach might take the crown because of the impact it had on so many people. But it was something that arguably was more the susceptibility of the operating system that wasn't able to recover itself after a reboot and after a glitch in the system. Had big impact, but wasn't technically even a breach. So most impactful technical incident, maybe we could give it that.
I would say that. I would say that would win. Yeah.
I feel like a lot of people though were like, "That's cool. I got the day off work." Like
people did, but that's only because a lot of other people were working overtime.
Yeah, for sure.
All right, so we chalk this one up as mostly unanswerable.
Yeah.
But
I think
fun to discuss.
We'll check back in a few months if there's been.
It's more of a
new
personal.
one.
Maybe the only way to do it would have an annual award.
An annual.
What was the biggest one of the last year?
The breaches, yeah.
But for now, it's unanswerable.
Post Rusty.
Yes.
Wonderful. Well, thank you so much for joining us today, Rusty.
Yeah, thank you guys. I appreciate it.
Glad you could be here.
It was a good time. We didn't get anything solved, but it was a good time.
And we
didn't have any bourbon.
I was just going to say, we didn't talk bourbon or drink any bourbon. We might have to go do that now.
Yes.
That's what time is it? 4:30? Close enough.
Let's all get out of here and have a drink.
It's close enough.
Well deserved.
Yes.
All right. Well, again, thanks a lot, Rusty. Thanks to everyone else for tuning in to another episode. We'll see you all again soon.
Yeah, we'll see you next time.
Thanks, guys.
Stay safe.